All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's really great to have you here. My name is William Roca. I'm the Director of Programs here at Village Preservation, and we're very excited for you to join us this evening for the program Broken City, Land Speculation, Inequality, and Urban Crisis, the new book by Patrick Condon, who will be in conversation with Village Preservation's Executive Director, Andrew Burman. Just some quick Zoom protocols. This is a webinar, so everyone's camera and sound is automatically off. But please, this is an active conversation. So if you have questions, please do not hesitate to pop those into either the chat or the Q&A feature. And those questions are going to be asked towards the end of this evening's presentation. Now, if you're joining us for the first time, just want to tell you a little bit about who we are. Village Preservation dates from 1980, and we work to document, celebrate, and preserve the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. And we've helped secure for over 1,250 buildings landmark designation. And we host over 75 free programs like this throughout the year. So you see that QR code on your screen there. Please go ahead and consider becoming a member of Village Preservation and check out all the other things that we have on our website. We have an enormous number of resources, a really great blog, and a wonderful image archive. So head over to villagepreservation.org to learn a little bit more about the work that we do. And you can also check out some of our upcoming programs. We have a couple of great programs that still have some space available. Tuesday, July 23rd, Imagining Greenwich Village and Lego. And please do check out, we have a fantastic little Greenwich Village Lego set available. So if you're interested in purchasing that, please take a look at our website. And this program is going to be talking about how that came about. Then on Thursday, July 25th, we started a nightclub, the birth of the Pyramid Cocktail Lounge, as told by those who lived it. This is definitely going to be an exciting program. Pyramid Club was awesome. I used to go there when they were still alive. So this is a wonderful oral history of that fabulous institution. But so please head over to villagepreservation.org, check everything out there. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew, who is going to introduce this evening's guest, and I will now disappear into the shadows.
Thank you so much for that, William, and welcome everybody. I am Andrew Burman, the Executive Director of Village Preservation, and I'm very excited for this program, which I've been looking forward to for some time. I saw Patrick speak a couple of weeks back as a panelist at the City Club, and his work definitely speaks to so many of the issues that we're grappling with here in New York. Patrick has over 25 years of experience in sustainable urban design, first as a professional city planner and then a teacher and researcher. He started his academic career in 1985 at the University of Minnesota before moving to the University of British Columbia in 1992. After acting as the director of the Landscape Architecture program, he became the James Taylor Chair in Landscape and Livable Environments. In that capacity, he's worked to advance sustainable urban design in scores of jurisdictions in the US, Canada, and Australia. He's also led the Sustainability by Design project by the Design Center for Sustainability. For over 20 years, the Design Center and James Taylor Chair worked on a variety of projects and books to contribute to healthier and more sustainable urban landscapes. So we're going to hear from Patrick about his latest book and work. Then Patrick and I are going to have a bit of a conversation, and then we will share some of your questions as well. So Patrick, I am handing it over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thanks everyone for joining these Zoominar. Not the best way to communicate, but it sure makes it easy for me to join you from the West Coast. I'm presently in Vancouver, and this is who I am officially, but at the same time, I think it's probably useful to for you to know a little bit about who I am beyond this in order to have some better appreciation for where I'm coming from, and particularly where I'm coming from on this issue. So I'm just a guy from Brockton, Massachusetts, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I love the word Commonwealth, Commonwealth of Virginia, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, because it speaks to the origins of the Northeast and how we structured our attitudes about government back in the day. I'm not sure we still do, but this idea of Commonwealth is a thread that, you know, is a subtext of what I'm going to talk about. But I am just a guy from Brockton, Massachusetts, and we claim our authority based on our pugilists. Rocky Marciano is one of them, and more recently, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, which gives you some idea of the skills that were necessary growing up there. But pugilism wasn't my game. Sustainable cities became my game, partly inspired by growing up in my hometown of Brockton and seeing what happened to it over the decades. And I've been doing that for 40 years, and I have a number of projects. If you want to Google one of them, you could probably go to the East Clayton project, where we developed 5,000 housing units that were affordable, including rear lanes and things like secondary suites and commercial services within a 5-minute walking distance and so forth, which are all very good things to do. And I want to make sure people understand that I have a history of encouraging sustainable densities, what you might call urban densities, in suburban locations and in urban locations throughout my career. I am not a theorist. I'm not a real estate economist PhD. I am an empiricist. I do claim methodological skills from 40 years of looking at the facts, and you know, I'm one of those guys that the facts don't lie. And along these topics, I've written a number of books. That's just to display I've been at this for a while. All 4 of these are really urban design books. And gradually, as my career has advanced, I've become increasingly concerned about affordability and why my efforts and the efforts of others in the Vancouver region and internationally have failed to produce the outcome we imagined would be almost automatic if you add density to communities. That should lead to more affordability. And unfortunately, that has not turned out to be the case, certainly not turned out to be the case in Vancouver or the Vancouver region. In the end, I have concluded, after 40 years of struggling with this issue about affordable housing, that the problem is all about the land. My training was originally in landscape architecture, and I'm surprised it took me 40 years to really figure that out. So the problem of land price will be the dominant thread of what I will be talking about tonight, and is really the dominant thread and something that's peculiar, I think, to my book that doesn't show up in other books about housing affordability. Broken City is my first book about how urban land, who gets a piece of it and who doesn't, is the major influence driving inequality. I wrote the book Broken City because I am angry, because ordinary wage earners can't afford housing anymore. And I have discovered that just adding density and asking the market to fix this problem is not a solution that I have found to be effective. And the trend is more and more people living on couch surfing, living in tents, and living in this kind of situation. I was just in Bozeman a couple of weeks ago talking about the book, and this is what's going on in our more rural communities, where you have basically RV parks that are out on the street. My conclusion is this: it's not the building that costs too much, it's the land under the building that costs too much. And in the next few minutes, I will be trying to explain why that is, something that's not really talked about very much. How could that possibly be the essence of the problem? The Vancouver example is very illustrative, and it's similar to what I call global cities around the world, whether they be Shanghai, London, Sydney, Australia, San Francisco, and of course, New York City. In Vancouver, why didn't add tons of new density to existing neighborhoods lead to affordability? The same strategies that are being touted as a solution to the so-called housing crisis, and it is a crisis, those solutions have been tried since the 1960s, at least in Vancouver, to deal with this problem, and they have not generated positive results. We added more supply than any other North American center city. Now I'm speaking specifically about the city of Vancouver, which sits in a larger metropolitan region, certainly in the center of it. And this center city has added more housing than any other North American center city. We've tripled the amount of housing units within the city limits. And of course, it's famous for this thing called Vancouverism. And this picture of downtown in 1960 versus downtown in 2000 is indicia of this incredible effort that nowhere else had even tried. We've nearly doubled population. We've nearly doubled average density throughout the city, which is what this graph shows. And we've tripled housing units in 1960, all through infill. It was an already built out city. So all of this new density had to come in the form of, well, obviously towers on the one hand, but also secondary suites in the basements of old bungalows, encouraging 4-story mixed-use commercial on our arterials, and of course, lane houses, and then changing our zoning away from single-family zoning into a zoning policy now that has for a number of years allowed people with so-called single-family homes or a single-family home parcel to have 4 to 5 dwelling units, and now moving towards 6 dwelling units in a recent change of our zoning. All in an attempt, largely, to make housing more affordable. This graph shows that Vancouver on the far left has done way more than any other North American center city in this regard. You can ponder this at some other time. New York City is down there in the middle somewhere in this zone. So it's a small city. It's 600,000. So in some ways, it's unfair to compare it to New York City. New York City may have added more housing units, but not as a proportion of the total. And despite this Herculean effort, here's the story. Our housing over that same period of all this effort has risen consistently and become the most expensive housing in North America and the third most expensive housing in the world, only slightly below Hong Kong and Sydney, all being measured as the gap between average household income, which is shown on the brown line, and the cost of housing relative to that average household income on the blue line. It's gone from an increment of around 3 to 4 times the average household income to over 12 times the average household income. All of this data is inflation adjusted, by the way. It now takes 29 years for the average wage earner to save up for a reasonable 6-figure down payment for a very small house in our city, or unit, we should say, since the majority of this new additional units has been almost entirely not in single family homes, but in some kind of form of condominium or apartment built into previous single family homes or purpose-built apartment buildings. So it raises the question, if adding new density or new supply, as your new mayor contends, would bring down prices, Vancouver should have the cheapest housing in North America. It has the most expensive housing in North America. The question in your minds is why? Why didn't this work? I'm here to offer the supposition, I suppose, if not the solution to that question, which is what happened to us is as we added new density, the price of the building didn't go up, but what did go up was the price of the land underneath the building. And that price of the land underneath the building went up in parallel with the allowed new density. When the city allowed new density, the immediate or gradual impact of that was that it influenced land price to the point where our objective of making more affordability by diluting the land price component of the new structures, as this illustration shows, was thwarted by that increase in land price, such that the per square foot price of the new higher density building never ended up being any cheaper than was the building that it replaced, because the land price went up. Here's an example. We're lucky in the city of Vancouver where we have an excellent resource, which is you can go in and map your own property, and they all say the same thing. The blue line indicates the change in land price over the last 10 or 15 years versus the change in building value on our assessment record over the same period of time. And as you can see, for a low density building on the top or a higher density building on the bottom, the ratio stayed the same. The buildings, in some cases, decrease in value or stay just the same, while there's been an explosion in the inflation-adjusted value of the land of like 500% over that 15-year period. Oh my God. Zooming in a little closer so you can understand, the land value under that single-family home on the left is $3 million. The land value on the right is $40 million. You would have hoped that the land value of the higher density building would have been commensurately or on a per unit basis lower, but by virtue of adding that new density. But indeed, sadly, that did not happen. I think I've made my point. New York City, where many of you are residing, land value is equally insane. The value of just the privately owned land in Manhattan Island is approximately $2 trillion. And most of this land assumes that value because its use is residential. So quite unlike what people might think, it's not the office towers or the commercial buildings or the industrial buildings. It's actually the residential buildings where most of this value resides in the land. This land has increased in value by over 3,000% since 1995, or by over 2,000% in inflation-adjusted terms. This has not happened in Manhattan ever before, although maybe you might go back to the Gilded era of the 1880s and the 1890s for a similar circumstance, and similar in the sense that people who were making just an ordinary wage had no access to affordable housing, and certainly were out of the market for buying anything, whether it be an apartment, condo unit, or a duplex or a fourplex or anything that was available at that time. They were all largely held by the landlord class, and we are seeing a resumption of that same phenomenon as the percentage of Americans who own their own home is dramatically shrinking. It used to be 68%. Now it's about 64%. I don't know the specific statistics for New York City, but this is a trend line that's not just local, it's a trend line internationally, and is an indicator of this new stress, which is largely manifest in real estate land price. All right, what can we do? Like the Greeks say, what can we do? What can we do? We're helpless against this. So I don't want you to think that we're helpless. I tried to put in the book some useful contemporary prototypical responses to this. And one of them is actually Vancouver. Despite all this problem that I identified with our failure to provide affordable housing, most of our major new developments throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s incorporated a way of taxing land specifically to prevent all this new value that's new zoning was creating from going only into the pockets of the landowner or the land speculator, more specifically. They developed a strategy of asking for, or indeed insisting on, 80% of the new value when you move from like a 2-story building to a 20-story building. You can imagine that new value is incredibly increased in the many millions of dollars for just one high rise. The city was successful in extracting 80% of what we called land lift in a negotiated relationship with the developers, saying, you can have a 20-story building, but here's the deal. There's going to be increased value that comes from that, and we want 80% of that. Now that impact fell on the landowner, which was not the developer most frequently. So the landowner, being a different entity, was faced with the possibility of not agreeing to that deal, or saying, okay, I agree to it, because the landowner got a doubling of the value of their land. They get to the 20% which was left on the table went to the landowner. So that what we call motivated the sale. And indeed, it did work, and the land was sold. And in the billions of dollars went to government coffers. Much of it was used for social housing projects like the one that you see here, and to finance the beautiful public realm, which is worth $1 billion or more, which is why people now go to the city of Vancouver and walk around and have a great time. It's a wonderful city. Community facilities like daycare centers, school sites, and this community center, which there are many of in Vancouver. This one rehabilitating an old railroad switching station. Beautiful project. That's example one. Example two of my greatest hits is Cambridge, Massachusetts, which has said, basically, they've done this thing called the Affordable Housing Overlay. Now, this is a different strategy. This is not capturing the land lift cash like Vancouver has done. This is managing land price escalation for social benefit. So what they did was they put a zoning overlay over the whole city, and they said, no matter what the zoning is, you can double the density. Go ahead, only in return for an agreement to provide 100% affordable housing. Now I have to really specify, affordable housing is different than social housing, right? Because social housing is usually identified with people who make less than 20% of median household income, people who really need help. But this non-market housing that it was required, the way they did it was they said 80% of this housing has to be affordable to people making the median, basically the median income, household income, which is about $100,000 in that part of the world. And a certain percentage of it had to be available for people making 60% of the median. And then there was a set aside for Section 8 housing for those people in the bottom 20%. So that's how it's structured. And that structuring is very important, obviously, for the social objective. But the secret sauce here is that requirement changes the building pro forma. It changes the amount that usually the nonprofit developer can afford to pay under the circumstances that I've just described when they pencil out the rent returns that come monthly. What the NGO can afford to pay for the land, it's called the land residual. And so this strategy of allowing a double density, but insisting on affordability, prevents that elevated land price from thwarting your desire to create affordable housing. So that, and if the landowner says that's a shitty deal, I don't like that deal, the city is able to say, look, we haven't disadvantaged you. This basically does not interfere with constitutional protections for property rights, because the city is not interfering with the ordinary pathway for investor return on urban land and a new project and a new building that's built into the market at market prices. It does not interfere with that. What it does is it's basically it's a dramatic use of density bonusing, the most dramatic in the United States, and I recommend it for entire cities, or if not entire cities, in the case of New York, entire quadrants of the city. And the only loser is the land speculator, who would otherwise have gotten a giant payday by a doubling of allowable density. And at the end of the day, the units would not be affordable because of this additional supply. That's the lesson of Vancouver. That is what we learned, that additional supply, for a variety of reasons, only some of which I've touched on. I've given you the sort of fourth grade version of the kind of real estate economics behind this. But what I'm saying is true. It thwarts that circumstance. Now, I'm an urban designer. I'm not a real estate economist, as I mentioned before. And what I like to applaud about the Cambridge example is that in this doubling of density, in order to politically get this to be acceptable in that highly, everybody knows you can't get anything done in Cambridge because everybody has a better idea. So in that highly charged political atmosphere, they were able to go around neighborhood by neighborhood and show prototypical examples that were drawn from prototypes that were compatible with the existing organic structure of those communities. And I'm very committed to the idea that there is an organic structure to communities that you can work with in order to achieve these social objectives, in order to create housing for our sons and daughters and for the service workers who we need to keep in our communities because they make our communities run. And they, of course, they constitute over 50% of the jobs now are in the service industry sector. Here's just one example project where they, along Mass Avenue in Cambridge, some of you may have driven down that otherwise kind of horrible street. And this example is one use of this strategy, which shows the preservation of the style of Victorian heritage building with a load of density brought into the project, basically in the backyard. If you really look at the parcels in places like your Queens or a lot of parts of the New York metropolitan area, there is a lot of capacity for additional housing. But this example shows that additional housing can be done in a way that, in the Cambridge example, both provides affordable housing for average wage earners and works within the organic fabric of the neighborhood. I showed this one in Montana a couple of weeks ago. They go, "Oh no, I don't like that." So I hope you like it, but you know, I think as a prototype, it's quite interesting. So I'm done. I mean, my message here, and I hope you like the book. You know, I get 50 cents for every copy, so buy a bunch of copies. My main message here is don't just upzone hoping for affordability. The lesson that I'm emphasizing is insist on it. And the only loser in insisting on it is the land speculator, not the present landowner, because the value of that land is not diminished. If you use the Cambridge example, the value of that land is simply stabilized at current market value. So no loss, no foul. Don't just upzone hoping for affordability, insist on it. And generally, I recommend Cambridge requires 100% affordability for their strategy, which is very ambitious. But I would suggest at least 50% non-market housing leveraged from the cash that comes in from your out of control housing market. There are billions and billions of dollars just thirsty to come into the New York metropolitan region to capitalize on extracting the potential gains from this land value, which can only be really extracted by adding market density. But if your market is robust, that gives you the opportunity to use that market to leverage a proportion of that for your community building objectives. And the one this decade, probably for the next 40 decades, if global warming doesn't kill us all first, is probably because this is clearly a global trend of it used to be that wages were the most important thing firing up an economy in the 80s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now it's asset value, where people with assets are largely making their money from the asset. And a lot of the energy about buying a condo unit in your community comes from potential buyers, whether they're investors or homeowners, expecting an 8 to 10% increase in the equity value of that project or that unit going up at that rate every year, which makes the odious and burdensome amount you have to pay for it make sense because it's an incredibly good investment. So I think that might be the last slide, and I hope I've not bored you too much, and I hope that for those of you who want to get more detail, I'm an academic, so there's a million footnotes in this, so it's not just my opinions. Please remember it's 50 cents a copy for me, and the publishers get the rest. All right, thank you very much. I'll turn it back to Andrew.
Well, Patrick, thank you so much for that. That was very interesting, and it's certainly already generated lots of interesting questions and comments. Let me start with a few of my own here. One thing that I'm interested to hear your perspective on more is what the role is in the last several decades in terms of these spiraling housing costs that we've seen, particularly in cities, from an increasing emphasis on housing being used as an investment, as something where people are parking their money, something where that people are putting their money into it with the expectation of a particular grand return on investment. And how much has that changed over the years and contributed to the spiraling housing costs?
Yeah, I touched on that in my closing comment about the best investment you can make in Vancouver, despite my complaints, is housing. I mean, even in the Depression in 2008, our housing did not go down. So smart people buy housing here, whether they intend to live in it or intend to just rent it or intend to just hold it. It's a smart investment. And it's not just a smart investment for people in a metropolitan area. It's a smart investment for people globally, many of which, or perhaps most of whom, are local because they've got the equity. They can roll over the equity. They can leverage their equity and put it into 2 units instead of 1. A lot of people here do that, and it's a good idea if you want to secure your retirement. So that's at the retail level, but at the global real estate investment trust level, it's grandma's pension money who's going into these real estate investment trusts, and they're making this decision similarly based on the assumption that we can promise you returns, promise in quotes, of course, of between 8 and 12% a year for your grandma's pension. And that's also fueling this exaggerated asset value of real estate. Real estate globally is now the largest single asset category. And this phenomenon only shifted in the last 30 years, but now it's a monster in terms of its how many tens of trillions of dollars more valuable is residential real estate globally than factories or any other material asset class. So that's the global thing. So sometimes you talk about in localities, well, let's restrict people buying a second house and all that stuff. that's useful. We've done a bunch of that here in Vancouver, and a lot of places are trying that, but it's not sufficient to deal with this overwhelming global glut of asset cash, a lot of it, maybe the majority of it, in the hands of retail people like your grandmother or your uncle, who's capable of leveraging the $2 million from his suburban home into a rental unit in a new condo in Brooklyn. So that's really what the driver is.
So it sounds like, among other things, the fact that capital can flow so much more readily internationally as well, particularly for those who are looking for a good investment and a good place to park it, is one of the contributing factors. It also sounds as though you're saying trying to push back on the sort of second and third homes can be helpful, but it won't solve the problem by itself.
No, I'm saying my conclusion has been once the people, like there was this guy called Henry George who back in the day, American economist, almost fomented a revolution during the progressive period for identifying land as the culprit. The reason why people were poor was because landlords were capturing the land in all the places where ordinary people needed to be. So he became famous for this idea of the single tax on land and no tax on income and no tax on capital. From that, my point being, there is some revival of that understanding now, and I'm one of those people who's trying to revive that understanding. But in the absence of really understanding that fact, which I think very few real estate economists do, and certainly nobody in the real estate industry wants to acknowledge that, because a lot of people in the real estate industry make the majority of their profit from land speculating. A thing like, obviously, land banking, where you buy a parcel, you tear down the apartment building, you just run it for 3 or 4 years, you buy it at $2 million, you project how much it's going to be worth in 5 years, tear down the rental building, get a permit. All that time you're land banking, you're slowly getting the permit approved and all that other stuff, which costs you literally almost nothing in comparison with the land purchase price and the building construction price, in anticipation of you will get 30% more per square foot of built space if you just wait 5 years. And that 30% is a better return on your investment than moving fast and capitalizing on that quickly.
Got it. So let me ask you this. I mean, it sounds as though the philosophy that we're seeing manifest ever more vigorously here in New York City, which is that we have to just build more and more market rate housing in order to make our city more affordable. We have to kind of build our way out of our affordability crisis, leveraging the market. Sounds like that hit Vancouver a couple of generations ago, or a generation or two ago. I'm curious if, in the case of Vancouver or of any other places that you've looked at, how much do you think there was a sort of genuine belief that that would have a positive effect, and how much of it was serving the interests of the very powerful real estate industry in, what sounds like a social good, but really is, sort of helping the folks with the deepest pockets who are always going to be able to influence policy disproportionately?
Yeah, here's the thing, Andrew, and for the rest of the audience, I've got enough gray hair to be believed if I say I've been here for over 30 years now, and I've been a party to all this. And in my own life and in my own passions for the first part of that career here, I was a true believer that the thing called Vancouverism, some of you in the audience have probably heard that word, was touted by me and others as a strategy for not just a great sustainable city, but also the social equity that would come from basically bringing the middle class back to the urban core, those kinds of things. And in that way, being socially and ecologically more sustainable. I was a true believer, and I worked with a bunch of developers who I believed in. I still believe in them, But the market here has proven that I was wrong. And those developers who are still saying the same thing might have been righter then, but they are wronger now for the reasons that I've identified. And I've spent time on this, and I've looked around the world, and the phenomenon is exactly the same everywhere. It's just that from my perspective in Vancouver, we've got the empirical evidence. Our economy, because of the liberalization of the global economy, which you mentioned, Andrew, where money can flow anywhere and everybody sees that as a good thing, free trade and all that kind of stuff, where it's considered still a bad idea to control your local, national, and your regional economies just for local benefit, because that's perceived to be, as Adam Smith and others have said, a bad idea. I mean, the global market should produce things efficiently. So that's Vancouver's dominant cultural, economic, financial circumstance, and it's no different than Vancouver, in New York or Sydney or London or Paris for that matter, even Shanghai, same thing. In Shanghai, their current problem is because they depended too much. All the land is state-owned, yeah, but they're selling it at 99-year leases, which is basically selling the land. And their economic model is the sale of that land would be ever increasing in value, such that they could afford to do things like the nationwide fast, rapid rail system and all this incredible infrastructure that they're building. But it's kind of hitting a wall at the moment. But it does come back to the land question.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, let me ask you this, and you mentioned this, there clearly are advantages, environmental advantages to increasing density. There's disadvantages as well, which sometimes get, sort of glossed over in the conversation. But given those advantages, how do you factor that in as you think about these policy approaches, recognizing that simply adding density is not going to make cities more affordable, and in fact may make them less affordable?
The hard problem now is the strength of the belief that our problem of housing affordability among industry, among government at all levels, and among citizens who intuitively say, that makes sense. Yeah, if I can't afford a house, there must not be enough of them out there for me to bid for. Makes intuitive sense. So in this moment where, we weren't talking housing crisis 10 years ago, even though housing was pretty expensive 10 years ago too. Now we're all talking housing crisis around the world. And there's a hair on fire thing that's going on where the dominant response is just build, let the market solve this problem. There are structural reasons why that won't work. But the issue is that the political atmosphere that we're all inhabiting now, it makes it very difficult to argue the way I'm arguing. But I still will insist that any time additional density is given in a significant way in a place like the New York metro area or within the bounds of the city of New York itself, it should come with a requirement that there is a social benefit. And the social benefit is affordable housing. And the only way to secure that, I think, is through the non-market housing strategy, which, if you think about it, over time, and Vienna did this, where over 60% of their land base has been removed from the vagaries of the land market. If you think about it, if you can shift a significantly larger percentage of your housing towards non-market housing, and New York is in a good position to do that, having a higher percentage of social housing and co-op housing than any other metro area in the United States by far. So you have a long tradition of doing this. If you do it for long enough, a sufficient amount of the land base becomes protected from that global pressure on the investment value of that land. And what's interesting, and the Vienna example proves out, also the ancillary side benefit of that is if you have, like, let's say 50% of your land is non-market in a million different ways, co-ops, NGOs, equity co-ops on trust land, that kind of thing. There's like 20 different variations of non-market housing, only one of which is so-called social housing for the poor. In the Vienna example, the result was the market real estate land ended up not costing about half as much now as equivalent land in Paris, because the non-market sector is large enough that it provides a counterweighting economic balance, if you will, and a choice for, a huge number of, like I say, sons and daughters and service workers, for a huge number of that cohort who you really want to keep in your city. It has a positive beneficial to some extent cheapening the market, so that people who want a market unit can also get one if they want. It doesn't foreclose that possibility, of course.
Right. Yeah, and of course, in New York City, we used to do that much more so. We had, what was called our Mitchell-Lama program, which built hundreds of thousands of units of middle and moderate income housing. But unfortunately, they built into it this allowance for the owners or developers to leave the system after 2 decades if they wanted to. And
they all want to. That's tax credit strategy. And when I was a planner I had planner in Westfield, Massachusetts before I started my academic career, and we had a project that was just like that, a great deal, and no direct taxpayer subsidy required, because it was just tax credits that rich people or rich corporations would use to offset against their annual tax requirements. And back in that day, I didn't think too much about 20 years going by and it reverting. That wasn't something I and others anticipated, but that is what happened.
Yeah, we see it every day here. Let me ask you this, one of the factors that we also point out gets too little attention is when you do go this densification route, you're inevitably going to lose a considerable amount of existing housing. Sometimes that housing is fairly affordable, and there's people living in it who are then displaced. I'm wondering how much you've looked at that and how much that also affects the affordability dynamic, the livability dynamic of cities, which is when you're encouraging people to build housing where housing already exists, you're going to lose housing and you're going to displace existing residents.
You see, this is why the argument that adding houses is going to lead to affordability is probably wrong. When they talk about adding housing, they're talking about adding market housing. And the only housing that the market will supply and the developer will not go broke trying to build and sell is basically at the luxury end. It's going to be the highest 5 to 10% of housing cost for that unit, whether it's in rental costs or in condo costs. And if they can't get it, they're not going to build it. So there is no evidence, and this is debatable. Some people on the call probably are thinking there is research, so it's debatable. But to me, there's no evidence that overall adding market density leads to affordability through what is called trickle-down housing. If you assume that supply is the problem, then it must be supply artificially keeping prices high. Weirdly, that's not true, even though it's intuitively true. What really is going on is the market is only capable of producing high-cost housing, which is not going to benefit the circumstances of the people still in the housing that existed before the construction. And a lot of that construction is going to drop on top of a 4-story apartment building, and it's going to be a 20-story apartment building. So if you look at the demographic, what that's going to really influence is people who are in the service worker category in your community who are going to be bounced out. Now in Vancouver, they have this really aggressive supply thing. Despite my praise, they completely lost the plot. in my view. They have a very aggressive tower-focused strategy to build out a whole new part of the city, and there's going to be 50,000 new housing units within a geographically very small area. And they've tried to build in a displacement strategy. So if a building drops onto your parcel, you get 3 years rent during the construction period to go who knows where. And then when the building is finished, you come back into the building at the pre-existing rent. I don't remember how many years that's guaranteed for. I don't think it's guaranteed forever because we have rent control, which allows for a 2 to 4% increase every year. So that would be the increment of increase in that rental. But the point is that, yeah, there are things you can do, but there are things you can do to mitigate this problem. But the problem with the mitigation strategy is you're working from the wrong strategy to begin with. You're working from a strategy that says adding density is going to lead to affordability, and that's not the case. Now, I also want to say to the Cambridge example, because they have this intention of the buildings themselves have to be organically matched to the kind of neighborhood they're going in. It tends to mean small parcel development. So you're not talking towers. You're not talking glitzy view of downtown Manhattan from Brooklyn kind of thing. You're talking about more ordinary scaled interventions. So in that sense, the social consequences of that are, I think, easier to manage. And don't forget that the new building ends up being 100% affordable in that case. So, there's a direct relationship between whoever is in that area and the building that is replacing it in terms of its social objectives that don't exist when you're just dropping a market project.
Right, right. Yeah, I think the philosophy that if we just let the market have fewer restrictions and build more of this incredibly expensive housing, that it's going to, make it cheaper for everybody, would be like telling Vera Wang to, produce more designer gowns and somehow it's going to bring down the prices of work clothes that, the average Joe purchases at Kmart. It just doesn't work that way. The housing that's being produced by the market, at least in New York City, in a lot of parts of the city, is very, very, very expensive, very different than the kind of housing that the people who need housing are looking for, and the trickle-down effects are really just not going to reach them. But we've got a ton of great questions in the Q&A, and I want to try to hit on some of those. So let's see. Somebody's asking about the role of overseas investors, particularly from China, in Vancouver. Are you seeing a lot of empty units? Are they parking their funds there? How much of a factor has that been?
Here's how I answer that very frequently asked question. International capital is a huge issue for Vancouver and for everywhere. Some of that international capital comes from domestic sources, like your grandmother's real estate investment trust. Some of it comes from China, trying to get their money out of China. Some of it comes from my Uncle Bob, who buys 2 units because he can leverage that units from the equity he has already in his house, which is surprisingly in the millions of dollars, unexpectedly, in a house that he bought for $50,000 back in the 70s. So yes, our issue can be quantified to some extent as being a consequence of the desirability of Vancouver for Asian investment, particularly Chinese. But I argue against that being anybody's answer to the problem, because if it wasn't Chinese investment money, I'm very sure that there would have been more Uncle Joes leveraging that value, because this is a global issue and it's impacting certain cities harder than others. Oklahoma City, if anybody on the call wants a cheap house and you can figure out a way to make a living there, go there. You get a yard, you get everything for $150,000. You get a driveway, it's wonderful, a good school. So go there. But certain so-called global cities are just magnets for this money, which is basically, it's not the building that's costing too much. The cost per square foot of building a tower or a 4-story has stayed relatively the same. The change is the value of the dirt upon which that building is going to sit. That's what's being influenced by the globe.
Well, speaking of global cities, I've seen several questions that cite some European cities like Vienna or Paris taking a very different approach, and it's really the sort of social housing model, which is that they build or acquire a lot of housing publicly that is for the specific purpose of it being affordable to average residents of the city. And I'm sort of kind of curious your thought about that European model as compared to what we see happening here in North America.
Well, European models are usually considered to be anathema in American political circles, but I always point to Vienna as the best example of a long-term strategy which recognized that the problem was land value, strategically acquiring basically land and turning it over to nonprofit corporations. A lot of them are community corporations, competitively bidding on the project, which usually the city acknowledges that you're going to give this project to this group for less than the land is going to go to them at lower than its market value if you're just going to sell it into the market in return for the deed restricted requirements of the new housing, such as it has to be affordable in perpetuity. You can have equity co-ops, but the land has to be leased land with a consistent return. So if you do a long-term economic analysis of what Vienna has done, it actually is a benefit to the taxpayer in time. It's an immediate benefit to the social purpose of affordable housing. But over the longer term, if you manage it well, which is what Vienna has done, the fiscal sustainability of the city improves as well, because those people are still paying rents into the land, basically, is the way it works. And that land rent is going as a tax source to pay for the schools and pay for the roads and all the stuff that's around that land appropriately, as Henry George pointed out back in the 1890s, and Adam Smith pointed out back in the 1780s, that if you don't do something like that, the landlord is going to take every last nickel of the value that is created by citizens, entrepreneurs, wage earners, and so forth. Anyway, I'm getting too excited in answer to your question, so we'll move on to the next one.
All right, well, we've definitely got some great new ones coming in here. Let's see. It's something about the Irish government. Well, one of the questions that sort of frequently comes up is how is it that we can well, here's one question that somebody asked. Isn't one of the ways in which cities in the past have dealt with creating affordable housing by through infrastructure, by building more mass transit so that people could access their jobs from farther and farther outside of the city where land is cheaper? We don't seem to do that anymore. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, we did that here. And again, the unexpected consequence of that, putting sustainable infrastructure out there that you hope will supply affordability. And for a while it does. Suburban sprawl produced a tremendous amount of affordability during the 50s and 60s throughout North America, where grocery clerks could afford a five-room ranch out in, wherever, out in Long Island. we had that moment where the expansion of the land resource overcame this natural ability. It's a bit more complicated than that. I might come back to it. But the example of Vancouver is instructive. We've got a pretty good, way better than North American average city there. And New York is better, but unlike any other new North American city, we put a very expensive regional transit system in called the SkyTrain that serves all of Vancouver and most of the surrounding first and second ring suburbs, if you will. Based on that premise, exactly. That was one of the driving premises. But increasingly, what I found and others have found, and I just was writing an article about this good friend of mine, Richard Wozni, who passed away a few years ago, who was a real estate consultant who did thousands of these projects. He was the first one to say to me, when we build infrastructure, the only thing that happens is all the development they won't leave a nickel on the table, because all that, if it's $3 billion, there's going to be a $3 billion increase within in the land value within the service area of that new infrastructure. And very little of that comes back to the government that paid for that infrastructure in the form of property taxes. 1% is a typical annual property tax levy in most North American communities. That does nothing to capture that value. The other thing to mention, some of the audience might have read one or two of Piketty's books about this whole issue, which helps explain that between the end of World War II, for various reasons, and the 1980s, the value of urban landscape was undercut. And the bumper sticker way I will say it is the global asset economy was also undercut. So what there was the wage economy, not the asset economy, which is what we have now. So it's more complicated than that, obviously. But what that led to was a collapse in relative terms of the relative land value compared to the golden age. I used the word previously, that's escaped me, but the golden age, anyway, when the Vancouvers and Rockefellers were building all their stuff on Newport Island, the Gilded Age. Thank you, the Gilded Age. I mean, the situation was similar then, but World War I and the Depression and World War II and all that destruction and huge inflation, which eroded capital value, particularly of land and other asset values. That created a unique circumstances for American metropolitan areas around the issue, could housing be affordable for the average person? And what we call that period is the emergence of the middle class. And what we can call this period now is the disappearance of the middle class, largely because they can't afford housing asset value. And furthermore, it's the people under 40 who are really getting screwed in this one, unless they can go to the bank of mom and dad, which in Vancouver, 50% of our first home purchase is financed largely or in part, certainly the $200,000 down payment required, largely in part, not from the 25-year-old salary, but from the 70-year-old's line of equity to drag out of the equity. They're $3 million. They don't know what the hell to do with. They're going to be dead soon. They might as well give it to their kids now, and that's how it works for that generation. So that generation is being cut into two classes: those who have access to equity, bank, mom, and dad; those who don't. And those who don't are typically those who have not come from a middle to upper middle class parentage. They may be the people who've been gone to college and done all kinds of good things, but their parents rented all their life, for example, or that. Yeah.
I'm going to interject for 1 second. I just want to remind everybody that here in New York City tomorrow is the City Planning Commission's hearings on City of Yes. So, which really very much is germane to this conversation. So if you want to testify or submit comments, I've just dropped into the chat information about how you can do that and the particulars on the hearing tomorrow. Patrick, another question another topic that I saw come up in a few questions in the Q&A is rent control. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are about the impact of rent control. Obviously, you see arguments from all ends of the spectrum on that it's absolutely essential to keeping cities affordable. Others argue that it artificially restricts the market and it makes rents go up for everybody else if you're not lucky enough to have a rent control department. Curious your thoughts on it.
I think rent control is terrific. It's the white bread of this issue. Slice, Stephen. Because it manages urban land price. When you have rent control, it is one lever that you have at your disposal that can mitigate land price inflation. And in the absence of that, the rents all float to market, and it doesn't super benefit. Well, let me put it this way, so that the sale value of that profitable business in the absence of rent control will be priced out at its asset value plus its monthly rent return. Whereas with rent control, there's a tendency more so for when that building or that parcel has to change hands, and it will within a 50-year horizon. All parcels do change. They don't stay with your grandmother for 100 years. They change. When it changes in a rent control circumstance, its value, its purchase price that will be offered will be based on its monthly returns, not its speculative value for a future that we're all assuming now in the absence of rent control. So that's just one device. It's not the best device, but it's a good device. We have it in Vancouver. We've had it since the 1970s. There's a bunch of reasons why it can fall off the rails, one of which is our law does not cover when you vacate the unit. So there are strategies which are useful if you want to accelerate the vacation of those units to get now the re-rental can be put at the market price. And then with a building full of rentals at the market price, its asset value will go up and its sale value will go up. So we have a lot of problems. They're called renovictions, which is when presumably a building is going to have a new kitchen put in, which is a reason for an eviction. The system is often gamed, and they haven't changed that. Anyway, all by way of illustrating that I like rent control.
Good to hear. Good to know. So one other theme that I see in a bunch of the questions is that given the sway that the real estate interests can have over decision makers in government, how do we affect these sorts of changes in order to truly make our cities more affordable and provide the affordable housing, since oftentimes it actually goes against the landed interests and the real estate interests who do exert an incredible amount of influence and power in our cities?
I think it's very hard until you can attack the political philosophy behind things like the City of Yes. And it's not just New York that's in the grip of this. The assumed given from God assumption that if your prices are too high, supply must be too low. It's called the law of supply and demand. You freaking idiot. Don't you know anything? And that is a very dominant political idea among your mayor and among your governor, among my premier now, even against this background of great success in the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s with the strategy of capturing land lift. It's been abandoned because of the strength of this housing is still, that didn't work. It's still too expensive. We have to eliminate all the planning controls on it. It must be planning controls that are the problem. historic preservation, that's so 1970. You know, get with it. We have a housing crisis. So it's an incredibly powerful force, which is very depressing answer for me to give. With only a 5% probability of success, my only offering is that the proof, we have to demand that their strategy actually proves out. And empirically, when I look around the world, which I've done for more than a decade now, to try to understand empirically, does adding supply lower prices? The answer is no. So if your argument is that, if your only argument for doing what you're doing is that adding supply is going to fix this problem, hey, folks, prove it. It's not true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. I've seen people point to Minneapolis, which apparently in recent years sort of has taken this approach, and they say that their housing prices have leveled off, whereas in other places they've sort of continued to rise. But I've seen other analysis that said that while that may be the case, what's happened is the prices at the top end of the market came down, the prices at the bottom end of the market went up, which is exactly the opposite of what a kind of effect you would want to have. So I'm like you, I'm extremely skeptical, and yet to find what seems to be a good example of how this market-based solution theory really.
Yeah, I mean, you'll get at the meeting tomorrow. Minneapolis will be mentioned, Austin will be mentioned, Tokyo will be mentioned, a lot of places will be mentioned. But
Sure.
if you just look, let's narrow this down to the English-speaking world, dominantly the United States real estate economy. If you just look at that, the global curve for housing prices since about 1990 has gone up like this. And then for the United States in particular, there was a 2008 thing which brought it down, but the globe only went down a little bit, like Canada leveled off. The United States and the rest of the world have joined now on the same line. The United States has recovered its pre-2008 prices. Of course, Canada costs twice as much as the US per square foot, per interior square foot. So you think you got it bad there. It's much worse here. If you look at the ratio between housing prices and wages, it's ridiculous. No one should live here. We should all leave. What I'm leading up to is a statement that things like a local planning change about allowing granny suites or secondary suites, yeah, we've done all that. And you might be able to identify through research a blip or a reduction in the increase, hopefully for a long time. Hopefully it worked. But when you set that graph against the one that I just described, those things are nothing compared to the global market's appetite for this real estate. And when you get global interest rates going from 3% to 7%, now we're in this kind of wavy line for global real estate values. Oh, everybody thought it was going to go down 20 points. It only went down 2, and somehow it's going up again. How the hell is that happening? Why it's supposed to go down when interest rates go up? Oh, it must be because the world thinks that this asset is more protected against inflation than the other ones, and this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Anyway, things like Minneapolis and Austin, which are supply driven, end up looking like, in my view, rearranging deck chairs on a Titanic, which the iceberg is land price.
Sure. Well, Patrick, I see 3 quick things here in the chat that I want to respond to. One is somebody's asking whether or not tomorrow's City Planning Commission hearing is also going to be accessible by video. It is. Just click on the link in the chat that I dropped. Someone earlier asked whether or not this will be recorded and shared. It is, and it will be. So you'll get an email from us with a link to the recording once it's available, and it'll be up on our YouTube page. And Patrick, finally, I'm just going to pass along a comment. Somebody has urged you to submit an op-ed to the New York Times with your point of view on these issues.
I did, and it didn't make the grade. So I'm not surprised, because the New York Times for me is the global Death Star. in conversations along the lines that I'm having. And it very much disappoints and surprises me because the New York Times could be in a position to do so much good or do nothing. It would be better if they did nothing, but they're coming out again and again and again with a very one-sided argument about this is a supply and planning problem. Planning is in the way of supply. We need more supply will fix it. All other considerations are so 1990. Get back. We have a housing crisis. We're not listening to you anymore. So the New York Times is the bugler for that. I'm sorry, but they are.
Well, and they certainly have been for some time on these sorts of issues. Well, on that note, I'm going to wrap and say thank you to you, Patrick, so much. This has been incredibly enlightening and engaging. And I'm very glad that we've been able to have this conversation, particularly on the eve of tomorrow's City of Yes hearing. And hopefully we will continue to be in touch and talk about these issues, because I think, as you know better than anybody, there's an almost tidal wave of force pushing in the other direction. And it's very important that these empirical viewpoints be aired and hopefully help inform the conversation.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, William, and thank you for all of you people who have stuck this out. So I appreciate the attention.
Glad we could do it. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and please join us for our upcoming programs as well. Good night, everyone.